Thank you both so much for sitting down with us at Temple of Geek. We're so excited to talk about Space Command Redemption.
Thanks.
My first question is for Mark. What began your love affair with sci-fi and storytelling?
Well, it's kind of burnt in the bone. As far back as I can remember, I loved science fiction. See, I grew up in the 60s and 70s when science fiction was in parallel with the space program. So you'd read a book by Robert Heinlein about, people going to Mars or landing on the moon, and then you'd get your LA Times delivered, and the headline would be people landing on the moon. And so there was this great sense of being and living in science fiction. And the TV shows that were on were Twilight Zone and Outer Limits and Star Trek. And so it was this great time of exploration and possibility. And it was one of the few positive things happening in the world, because this is during the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement with the cities burning and all of this stuff. But science fiction offered a great hope of possibility for the future that was just magical.
Amazing. Doug, speaking of magical and possibility, you have brought so many beloved, memorable characters to life across horror, fantasy, and sci-fi. What helps you seamlessly transform into your roles in these genres, especially when usually you have a lot of prosthetics or mocap involved?
Well, thank you for thinking that it's seamless. Whenever I watch myself, all I see is my own flaws. But so I think as long as I start as an actor, I don't think of myself as a physical performer. I think of myself as an actor first. So I really do need to ingest every character's wants, needs, loves, motivations, their relationships on film, all that any actor should do for their role, right? And then when you add an extra layers of look to that character, that's where another skill set comes into play, which might be a little bit more physically performative and a bit more athletic at times, depending on the role. Yeah. So, but with Space Command, what appealed to me right away when Mark suggested I play this android synth, we call them, would be that it was my face with a metal helmet and some nice, beautiful clothes that were tailored just for me. I'm like, okay, that I'm already interested, right?
Yeah.
And then add to that, I had never played a mechanical human before, one that was battery powered. So that was interesting to me to give him a personality and a heart and soul, even though he was a machine. And he and Elaine Zicree wrote such a beautiful script. It was kind of like, it's very poetic. It's like Shakespeare in space, and it explores humanity and our human heart. And my part of the story is being told from the point of a machine. So that was such an interesting mix for me, and to find out what are our possibilities and where does the human heart really come from and what can it do? So that was all interesting to me.
And Shakespeare in Space, just to elaborate, it's not like flowery and Elizabethan. It's basically that it's just trying to tell a story of the human heart. And one thing about Doug, just to mention, is that I was writing a book with Guillermo del Toro at the time and met Doug at the Saturn Awards. I won the Saturn Award one year, and I took him to lunch a few days later. And so first of all, he has this astonishingly beautiful face, this amazingly reactive, responsive, delightful face. I mean, to cover that face up is like covering the Mona Lisa up with with a coat of red paint or something. You look like the portrait of King Charles now, But also, the thing about Doug that's so singular is that he has this great heart and this great soul. Any fan who's ever met him, this enormous compassion, this enormous empathy. His heart is like a beacon that shines out from him. And so I wanted to capture that. That was because the character of Dornevan is so deeply human. I viewed him as someone who could comment as an outsider on humanity. And the notion is, because the whole point of the story is, if you're on the wrong side, change sides. And our hero, not Doug's character, Doug's always on the right side of the equation of humanity and empathy and compassion. But our hero has to recognize that Captain Jack Kemmer has to recognize that he's on the wrong side, and he has to have the courage to change sides. And I think that what's going on in the world now is it's calling to us to act. It's calling to us to not settle into the old patterns, but rather to really see where we can be kind, where we can help end suffering and help unite humanity. And so this is why Doug was the perfect exemplar of that, because in his life he does that. Not to talk about you in the third person, Doug, but you're you're such a gift to everyone who meets you and works with you. Just an astonishing man.
Well, I can also personally attest to that because as Doug and I worked on a project almost 10 years ago, and it was, apart from the diva tantrums, he was great, which I'm totally about. There was another person throwing diva tantrums on set, but it was not Doug Jones.
Oh, yeah.
Let's never speak of this person.
Yeah, exactly. But I love what you were saying, because I think there is something that's so unique and special about sci-fi in that it can feel so relevant, but sometimes people can hear the message a little better when it's set in space and it feels a little more removed.
Right.
So my question for Mark is, how did your experience writing on iconic sci-fi shows like Babylon 5, Star Trek Next Generation, and Deep Space Nine inform the world that you've created in Space Command?
Well, it was great because, as I said, the three shows that made me want to be a writer were Twilight Zone, Outer Limits, and Star Trek, the original versions of those three. And I was lucky enough to meet Nichelle Nichols when I was a kid and go on the Star Trek set. And so the television screen always felt like a very permeable, it was like the mirror that Alice goes through in Alice Through the Looking Glass. It was a world that I wanted to be part of. And the lovely thing about science fiction always, because back then, the creators of those shows wanted to comment on humanity. They wanted to comment on the human condition. And they were deeply empathic and deeply human writers, Gene Roddenberry and Rod Serling and so forth. And so the great thing about science fiction is, for instance, if Rod Serling were writing an episode of Twilight Zone and commenting on, like Everett Dirksen or something, he was a politician way back when, who would care about that now? But if he's writing about man's inhumanity in man, like in Monsters of on Maple Street, it becomes timeless. And so Star Trek, any of these great science fiction shows or movies, they're timeless because they remove you from the outside moment so you can see the dynamic. You can see the interaction when you're freed from what might be polarizing in terms of the issues of the moment.
Beautifully put. Doug, when you read the script, was there a specific scene that you were particularly excited to bring to life?
Oh, golly. Well, I was very excited to be working with Robert Picardo. He was the human that kind of took me on. My backstory is that I was a synth. I was a high class synthetic. So I worked as kind of like a butler or a servant to very, very wealthy, high elite people. And I started asking questions that were not welcome. So they ended up putting me in like a mine as one of the worker androids. And that's kind of was the wrong fit for me. And there was a big accident, a big explosion. I was crumbled into some parts. And Robert Picardo's character is the one who kind of salvaged me and was putting me back together quietly, secretly, because the protocol was, trash the parts and start over again with someone new. But he thought he saw something in my eyes that gave him compassion, and he wanted to fix me. So I love the scene where he is quietly in his little laboratory, kind of like putting my parts back together, and we're having a lovely little quiet conversation of why are you doing this, and then his son beams in. And starts asking questions and like, oh, what do you have there? And there's something very family-like about that, and very, very touching and very, very human.
Yeah, I think it speaks to Mark. If I could just jump in, because I think when we think sci-fi, we think like sweeping space and robots and aliens, and I think it's a testament to you as a writer and a director and a storyteller that you were able to find these beautiful moments of vulnerability and intimacy.
Well, thanks. Well, that's one of the things I was very specifically. That was one of my agendas, which is often in science fiction, you don't see family members, you don't see friendships, there's not that human equation that in real life we do have. And sometimes the relationship might be troubled, sometimes it might be any number of things. And I think it's very lovely because, Bob Picardo's character has closed himself off because his wife died tragically. And he really is, other than loving his son, he's closed himself off to everything. And with Doug, when he saves Dor Nevin, Doug's character, they become friends. And that friendship saves them both, actually, emotionally. And there's one point where Doug says to Bob, he says, you're the only friend I've ever had. And because the show covers 200 years and 5 generations, we get to see the ramifications of those relationships, father to son to grandson to great-grandson. And, and one of the fun things with Bob Picardo's character is ultimately we're going to see Bob back again in a slightly different form, shall we say, but it's because Doug wants his friend back, and it really is a very touching relationship. And I'll tell you one thing, Doug, I don't know if you know, which is there's this great speech when you and Bob are talking, where Bob has this wonderful monologue about how he lost his wife, how she died. And when I wrote that monologue, yeah, it's a great scene. The two of you are so good in that scene. And when I wrote that monologue for Bob, I thought, I don't know if this works. I'll film it and see. And if it doesn't work, I'll cut it out. Because I really didn't know if that, it's like, let me tell you about my wife. It's like, oh, brother. But it just plays gorgeously. And I'm so grateful to the two of you. I mean, I always am moved to tears by that scene. It's so wonderful.
Oh, that is so wonderful. I think that just also you two perfectly encapsulated like the magic and almost danger, but in a good way, of filmmaking, and how we actually do need to experiment, even though there's all this planning. Then you just have to let stuff go.
Yes, well, that's why I love collaborating. By the way, and I'm sure you do too, Doug. It's like there's such wonderful magic that emerges from collaborating with other brilliant creative souls. That's why I've written novels and I can do it reasonably well, but I don't want to just be a guy sitting in a room writing endlessly and just being this pale, sad creature. So I love working with others. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
No. I mean, no, that was a beautiful insight you shared. My question, speaking of friendship and amazing souls coming together, Space Command is the result of a highly successful Kickstarter campaign. So I wanted to ask you both, how does it feel knowing that over 1,000 people came together and supported bringing this project to life?
Well, I'll just start in by Mark can answer this more detailed than I can, but this is the first Kickstarter campaign for this series of movies happened when Kickstarter was kind of new and young. So it was groundbreaking how this particular title went way over its goal, which just proved that people have a love for science fiction, and when you have a writer like Mark with his pedigree and the actors he pulled together, whether it was Mira Furlan and Bill Mumy and Robert Picardo and little old me, and it was those were names and faces that like the fan base recognized and wanted to see do something else and something together. So the response was overwhelming and lovely.
Amazing. Mark, anything you want to add?
Yes. Well, I've written for all the major studios and networks over 30 years of my career. And that was the way it was, the only game in town when I started in television. Television is such an expensive art form. It costs millions of dollars to make anything. And if you wanted to reach an audience of millions, you had to go via the studios and network. There was no other way to do that. But with the emergence of crowdfunding and the emergence of the internet and editing and shooting digitally, I saw that there was another alternative. And so, for instance, to get a show greenlit on a major network, you have maybe a handful of executives making that decision, but in order to do anything on Kickstarter, as you say, you just need a few hundred or a few thousand fans to say, yes, I want to see this, and it becomes a reality. I think it's an extremely viable way of doing things, and I have my Mr. Sci-Fi YouTube channel where I can share my process, my creative process with the world, and because I love that. So in other words, Doug's my collaborator on Space Command, but so is the audience in that way. And they don't have a say over me. In other words, they can't say, well, I love Doug Jones and let's paint him blue or something. No, though you've certainly had that experience, Doug, but they can have input. So they can say, well, so I think someone said to me, are there foreign languages in space? And they said, I don't mean Vulcan or Klingon. I mean like the languages we have here on Earth. They continue out into space. So I thought about it. I said, yes. So Mira Furlan and her daughter, they speak Serbo-Croatian and English in Space Command. And another one of our actors is from Venezuela. So I have a scene where he is talking to his dad and he's talking about his impending marriage and his fiancée is on the call. And they're speaking entirely in Spanish. And at one point we had a spaceship where Mira Furlan or Catherine McEwen, one of our other cast members, is found drifting in space in a survival pod, and the two guys who pick her up on their spaceship are Sicilian, and they're speaking in Italian. And that was because our DP and his right-hand guy were Italian. I said, hey, you're going to play these roles. But the funny thing was, it was scripted. They had a certain dialogue to say, and I actually had to find a third person who spoke Italian to make sure they weren't saying things that we would rather not have them be saying. because they're Sicilian and their language can get rather rough. So, but it was fine. So yeah, so I love all of this. I love all of it.
As an
You know, it's-
Italian girl from Jersey, I totally get the need for
You get
supervision.
it, sure.
Sorry, Doug, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was also going to say that sense of ownership that it gives the fans too. I do the convention circuit, so I do appear at a lot of fan conventions, whether it's sci-fi, horror, comic book, fantasy, all across the world. And I often get people that come up to my table saying, I'm a backer for Space Command. And it kind of gives us an instant connection, which is really lovely.
Yes, exactly. And it's so fun because, like, for instance, when I was a little kid, I actually, one night was when I was like 10, I was in front of NBC one night holding my little sign saying "Renew Star Trek," okay, with a whole crowd of other people. Because when Star Trek was going to be canceled after its second season, and 1 million fans wrote letters to NBC to get it renewed, and that got it a third season. If not for that third season, it would not have had enough episodes to go into syndication and, become what it became. So I was aware very early on that the fans had a relationship with science fiction that was fairly unique to that genre and horror and fantasy, where the fans follow us from show to show to show, and that gives both the audience and the creators a power that's fairly unique. I mean, someone may want to have a Kickstarter campaign for, like, Mannix or, any of the shows from the 60s, but they don't have that power that something like Star Trek or Deep Space Nine or any of these things has, because the fans take note of who the actors are, who the writers are, and so forth. And that's a lovely thing.
For sure. And I think it also speaks to your aptitude as artists, because I don't think anyone, connects with you and wants to follow you from show to show unless you bring something to the table that they really can, like, hold on to in a really beautiful way. And speaking of which, I mean, you both are these very, lauded pillars in your community, both as a performer and a creator. And as Mark, that you mentioned, the film industry is going through quite a major kind of shift right now. So I wanted to ask both of you, given that you both have these amazing 30 plus year careers, what are things that have helped you pivot and stay with the times, and any advice you have for people who are just now entering the industry?
You take it, Mark. Well, actually, in point of fact, my career is almost reaching 50 years, because I had my first professional radio play aired when I was 18, and my first short story sold when I was 19. And I started writing The Twilight Zone Companion at 21 and writing for TV at 22 or 23. So it's been a nice long run. I just wrote a book called Greenlighting Yourself that's available on Amazon, because I noticed that a lot of the how-to books of how to make it in Hollywood or make it as a writer were very outdated. They say, well, just write a great script. Well, how many TV shows and movies are great? Clearly, there's a lot of crap that's getting made, and it's not getting made starting with a great script, So, but also I wanted to say, and they said, well, just get an agent, write a script and get an agent. Well, that's really not the only way to make it happen. And so I wanted to write a book about how I've taken this journey and how it's like a cake recipe. You can apply it pretty easily. See, the thing about science fiction, again, that's unique, is science fiction started with fans who then became professional writers, Ray Bradbury and Heinlein and Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. And so they were very connected into the fan community, even when the fan community was only a few thousand people. And so because of that, there was always a history of mentorship in science fiction. You could go to the conventions, you could meet the major writers, you could meet and the actors as well. And so, for instance, Ray Bradbury was one of my mentors, and for over a decade, an amazing man. But his mentors were a slightly earlier generation of science fiction writers that included Lee Brackett and Henry Kuttner. Now, they're not well known today, unless you're a real sci-fi geek like me, but they mentored him. Then Ray mentored Richard Matheson and Charles Bowman and George Clayton Johnson, who became the key writers on Twilight Zone. And then, Ray and George Clayton Johnson mentored me, and Harlan Ellison was another one. Harlan was a very, very dear mentor and friend, and an amazing man. And Harlan told a great story once that really hit me in my heart. And Harlan, of course, is the writer who wrote probably the greatest Star Trek episode ever, The City on the Edge of Forever, on the original Star Trek, where Kirk goes back in time and has to basically literally throw the love of his life under a truck so the future, isn't screwed up and the Nazis don't win World War II. And And it was an amazing episode. I'd never seen anything like it. And because every TV show previous to that, the hero saved the girl. And in this one, he kills the girl. And it told me that in life there will be times when you have to do the right thing, but it will break your heart. And Harlan told this story because he came up with that, and he was always coming up with stories that were deeply personal, deeply from his heart, and meaningful. Okay, he was always looking to do something fresh and original and true, and emotionally true. And a friend of his came to him at that time when he was writing for Star Trek, and he said, I went in to pitch to Star Trek, this writer said, and I pitched the Flight of the Phoenix, and they didn't recognize that I was just ripping that off, and they bought it. And he was like chortling over himself because he'd had an easy sale. It was actually not a bad Star Trek episode. It was called Galileo 7. But Harlan said to him, listen, you cheated not only them, but yourself, because you had an opportunity to tell a story from your heart, to tell a story that would move the audience, that could change the audience for the better. And instead, you just pulled a fast trick and ripped off someone else's work. And that really stuck with me, because like every time I write anything, I'm always trying to find an emotional truth and find something I haven't seen before, and find a way of, having that direct, honest conversation with my audience.
In this new model, also from the acting perspective, the show business has changed dramatically since I started. What you were asking, and yes, it used to be that an actor had to depend on being hired by someone, whether it was you had to rely on casting directors, agents, managers, and then being directors that would cast you. Now, in the world of TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, people are creating their own content, whatever that may be. And so some of it can be well written and well produced, and some of it can be, while you're making eggs. So there's the range of content is so enormous now that if you do something good and something watchable and something moving and life-changing, you can get noticed on your own without having to be hired to do so. That's what's changed dramatically, I think, from the actors. And you don't have to live in LA anymore. We audition from over self-tapes and Zoom. So you could live in Oklahoma and then have a career in showbiz if you wanted to. Because, every time I've been cast here in LA, I fly somewhere else to film it. It seems like anymore. So the business has changed, quite dramatically.
And that's why my studio is here in Los Angeles, because my actor friends can, come home and sleep in their own beds, and, they don't have to go to, the far ends of the earth, and because there's a tax credit. But the other thing that's also really cool, and I feel often I have to explain how things used to be, because things have changed so greatly. And one thing that was amazing, it used to be that if someone wrote an actor and said, I'd like a signed photo, the actor would have to pay for the photo and the mailing and all of that and send it to the fan. Some genius had the idea of having conventions where actors could actually sign photos and sell them. And it's a win-win, because the fan gets to have a direct communication, a direct contact with the actor. They can get a photo with him or her. And but the actor has a second source of revenue that can be very, very important, particularly, like an actor who maybe spent 3 days shooting a Star Trek episode in 1966 can still make thousands of dollars signing photos at conventions each year. And a lot of people have the idea that if someone's on TV, they're wealthy. That's not true. Many, many actors are struggling. I remember Rene Aubergenois, who played Odo on DS9. I was once at his house, and he said, this is the house that Benson bought and Deep Space Nine saved, and that's because, for actors, it's feast or famine, and so, I'm glad that the fans can get that wonderful experience of personal contact, and the actors and actresses can survive.
Amazing. Yeah, it's very true, especially since that was so much of what the strike last year was about, was being able to keep this as something viable career path for all the, rank and file actors out there who bring our favorite stories to life. Excitingly, Space Command Redemption is available to watch on Amazon Prime Video and Google Play. I mean, I know you both just spoke. You've made my job incredibly easy. You've spoke so beautifully to this project. But is there anything in particular that you hope that viewers take away from the film?
Doug, do you want to take that, or I can jump in if you like?
Sure. I the word hope comes to mind. Especially what Mark mentioned earlier, the state of the world. We don't need to go into detail, but it's crazy out there. And there's so much anger and so much division and so much, battle and war, whether it's on a personal level within your own family or on a worldwide level, that I would like to see this story offer some hope that our future won't be bleak, that our future can be peaceful, and that can be productive for all of us.
That's great. That's lovely. Well, here's the thing. My response in all of this, my method, my entire career has been to take on something impossible and then pull it off, and then take on something even harder. And so it's all, And so Space Command is simply the starting point of what I'm doing. My goal is to create a studio doing multiple TV series, multiple features per year, and to create an ensemble of actors who appear in multiple projects. When I wrote the Twilight Zone companion, one of the great producers of Twilight Zone, the great producer of Twilight Zone, was a guy named Buck Houghton. And he was the perfect producer for Rod Serling. He was on the first 3 seasons of Twilight Zone. But prior to that, he tried a show that was a very interesting experiment for television. There was an actor named Richard Boone who starred in Have Gun Will Travel. It was a Western. And the idea was, it was called Richard Boone Theater. And the idea was an ensemble of actors that would play different roles in different stories. And so they might be a hero in one, a villain in another, but it would be that ensemble of actors. And so that's essentially what my wife Elaine and I are doing with our studio, with Space Command Studio. So Doug is appearing in Space Command, also in Elaine's film. Bob Picardo is appearing in Space Command and also in a new series that I'm creating with Rockne O'Bannon, who created Farscape. It's a show called Sweet Haven. And Ethan McDowell's going to be in multiple projects, our star who plays Captain Kemmer and is on Walking Dead. Because the idea is that this is a place where people can come and create meaningful work. And it's so, because we make Space Command by hand. It's me and Elaine and our little team of wonderful workers, behind the scenes and in front of the camera, where there is no network, there is no studio, there are no notes per se from above. Elaine and I come up with it, we write it, we cast it, we shoot it, it goes out into the world and is seen by millions of people around the world. So with Space Command, we just finished shooting hour 6 of the 12-hour season. In the next couple of weeks, we're already shooting hours 7 and 8 of the show and shooting Elaine's feature ongoingly. And so I continue to raise money from my various. The funny thing was, I didn't know I could raise money until Space Command. I'd always just worked for the studios and networks, and then it turned out I had a knack. I sell investment shares, I do Kickstarter campaigns, and the fans recognize quality, and that's. You hear executives. I don't know if you've ever heard this, Doug, but executives will sometimes speak very, very disparagingly of the audience. I remember one executive said to me, "The audience aren't like us; they're stupid, and we have to make shows that they will enjoy, that we would not enjoy." And I said, "I totally disagree with you. I totally disagree with that." And I remember Charles Beaumont, who was a writer on Twilight Zone, at one point he met with a producer on some movie project. And in the middle of the meeting, he stood up and he said, "You know what's wrong with television?" I guess it was a TV project. He said, "You know what's wrong with television? You're what's wrong with television, and I'm not going to work for you." And he walked out. And it's like, okay, yes,
King.
exactly.
Okay.
And when
right.
yeah, but when you look at the films you love, the TV shows you love, often it's collaborations between brilliant people. And so Doug and Guillermo, of course, that's a legendary team up. Or Scorsese with De Niro and some of the other actors he works with. When I give advice I run a roundtable where I advise thousands of people around the world, industry roundtable that I've just done for free for 30 years. And frequently I say to people, recognize when you're moving through your life, recognize people who are talented, who finish what they start, who say what they mean and stand by it, people of honor and talent, and affiliate with those, build teams. And that works enormously well.
Thank you both so much. I mean, I feel like not only am I pumped to watch Space Command again now, but I feel I'm leaving this interview incredibly inspired. How can we continue to support you both in your various, many, many endeavors?
Well, following on the social medias is always a great start because that's where everything is told of what's coming up next. So you can find me at Actor Doug Jones, all one word, all run together, at Actor Doug Jones on Instagram, X, Facebook, LinkedIn, Tumblr, Snapchat, on all the
Wow.
platforms. Actor Doug
As a
Jones.
Tumblr girly, I love that you're on Tumblr.
Thank you.
That's fun. That's fun. And in terms of me, the best way to reach me is my YouTube channel, Mr. Sci-Fi. That's MR period SCI hyphen FI, Mr. Sci-Fi. We have over 100,000 subscribers now. And my email is marczicree@gmail.com. And if you want to invest in Space Command or any of the other interesting projects we're doing, because we're creating new shows with the creators of The Expanse and Farscape and Defiance and Sequest and Alien Nation, and a new Rod Serling show is in the works as well. So there's a lot to come. So, but I'm just grateful that Doug Jones had the trust in me to say yes. And I mean, my life is Christmas every single day.
Oh, thank you both so much.